Wonderful to be back. It's been a week, but last time we spoke, we learned the Mishnah, which told us that in every generation, one is to see themselves if they left Egypt. Many halachas are derived from that. The way we sit at the Seder, leaning, setting up the Seder, a lot of there are a number of halachas that come out from the fact that we are obligated to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, including the fact that we actually make that statement as we conclude the recitation of the story of the Haggadah, which is where we're holding in the story in the order of the events of the night, which we're learning in the Mishnah. We're holding at this juncture where the Mishnah tells us to recap the story of the Exodus by highlighting the three items of the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror. And then it says, in every generation, one is supposed to see himself if they left Egypt, and we actually recite that Mishnah in our.
It's one of the remembrances, eh?
Yes, so that remembrance is one thing, which is connected. And but this specifically the night of the Seder, we read the statement. We actually read that Mishnah. We actually read that in our Haggadah. It's printed in our Haggadah, this Mishnah. Now we noted, and this is the main question we're going to be addressing here from a talk from the Rebbe. We noted that Rambam, as well as Alter Rebbe, when they quote this halacha, when they quote this law, that a person is supposed to see themselves as if they left Egypt, they make a very subtle but significant change. Instead of the word lirois, which means a person should see himself, they use the word laharois, which means a person should demonstrate himself. So it's a slight, in Hebrew, it's adding one letter. Lirois, add a hey, laharois. But that hey changes it from to see myself and to demonstrate myself, to show to others. And this is the question that the Rebbe is addressing amongst a bunch of other questions that we mentioned. But this is the main question. Where did Rambam, and then Alter Rebbe, who follows him, get this halacha that you're supposed to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt? The Mishnah only says to see yourself as if you left Egypt.
I left Egypt.
Right. And the Mishnah only says to see yourself as if you left Egypt. But they, when they make this halachic ruling, they say to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt. Where'd they get that from? Sure. Well, let's just close this door here since this guy's finished.
I'm thinking there's something before we get to it.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
That halachas need some sort of action-based.
Okay, see yourself as in
action.
See yourself
Turn
as
into a halacha. You need to have something that people could act.
Okay, so then here.
In that case, it's not always.
That's a very good idea, and maybe they'll come up soon. But you're saying halacha requires action-based rather than cognitive. So there are two things. First of all, what did the Mishnah mean then? Did the Mishnah not mean halachically? A, B, well, where did Rambam get it from? This new halacha that you have to show yourself.
Yeah, those questions still remain.
But yes, that's true. There's a certain actionable element to Rambam's phrasing, and therefore Alter Rebbe, who follows Rambam, that's how to demonstrate yourself.
That's how you see yourself when you demonstrate.
Okay, maybe. Let's see. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, good ideas. Let's keep those in mind, and we'll go. Okay, so we're at where it says Daled, page 40. Here. Hine now, Hadin Hanal Shebarambam. The above mentioned halacha and Rambam. Shebachol der v'der, that in every generation, chayav adam, person's obligated, loirak lirois, not just to see himself, elagam laharois, but also to demonstrate himself. Maybe Rabbeinu Hazaken b'Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe quotes that same halacha in his Shulchan Aruch, kohuvel he'il sif aleph, as we made mention above. If the Alter Rebbe cites or quotes that halacha in his Code of Jewish Law, which comes from Rambam, that one is to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt, not just see himself as if he left Egypt. You want to thank you. Ella, but with respect to the verse cited to substantiate this halacha, that one has to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt, meaning the pasuk from which we derive this law. Mishan Rabbeinu Hazaken, the Alter Rebbe is different in Rambam from that which the Rambam writes. Even though generally speaking, this halacha that one is supposed to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt, Alter Rebbe quotes from Rambam, as is indeed referenced to in the margins of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. There are sources to many of the Alter Rebbe statements, and there in the margins it says that the Rambam got this. Alter Rebbe got this law from Rambam. So generally speaking, Alter Rebbe is taken from Rambam. Yet, with respect to which verse they cite to substantiate this halacha that one is supposed to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt, Rambam and Alter Rebbe differ. How so? Rambam writes, as we spoke about last class, that the source for this halacha that you're supposed to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt, is from the verse which says, and us you took out from there. That's the pasuk says. That a person is supposed to say, and us that took us out from there. So us, meaning me, so I'm supposed to see myself as if I left. Okay, that's the verse. That's the Rambam quotes.
That still only supports seeing.
Yeah, okay, we'll get there, yes. But yes, good point. Which I think they mentioned that point earlier. Yeah. Right? They've also made mention.
And it's interesting that the Alter Rebbe cites to the Rambam for the source.
Yeah, they've asked that question.
But then
they've asked that question that you just asked.
We don't know
they've asked that last time.
We still don't know the source from which Rambam took.
Yeah, so we're getting there. Yes, that's right. We're piling on more.
I know.
We're piling on more questions. It's a methodology in learning which I got from my teachers. Just when you have a question, ask more questions. Because you ask enough questions, it'll point you into where the answer is.
Right.
If you have one question, you have one answer, okay. But if you have 20 questions, then obviously you're missing something fundamental, and then that new thing will click, and all the questions will go away. So there was piling.
Kind of like a calculus, you're trying to approach.
Yeah. Whatever will often do that, pile on questions, and then one shift and change, and all the questions disappear.
Right.
The more you ask, the more you know.
That's right. But here it's specifically about one topic. You ask more questions about one topic, and then it enlightens you to something that you're missing that helps reframe everything, and all the questions go away. So let's see. Okay, so Rambam, as we mentioned earlier, quotes the verse which says, and us you took out of there. But the Alter Rebbe Kaisev writes, quote, Shenemar, as the verse reads, that in the night of the Seder, a person's obligated to say, because of this, God did to me when he took me out of Egypt. So because the pasuk says to me, this is the proof that the Alter Rebbe cites to that a person is supposed to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt. So they give two different sources. Now, the reason for this change, move on, but Pashtus is understood quite clearly. Why? Because that's the verse cited to in the Mishnah. Remember, we have three stages here. We have historically Mishnah, a couple hundred years later Rambam, a couple hundred years later Alter Rebbe. Okay, Mishnah says, "See yourself as if you left Egypt." What's the verse it cites to? Because a person is supposed to say, "Because of this, God did to me."
Same as the Alter Rebbe.
Right. Rambam changes from see oneself to demonstrate oneself. Quotes the verse, and us you took out of there. Alter Rebbe quotes Rambam, which says, demonstrate yourself, but cites to the verse of the Mishnah. Because of this, God did for me. So it would make sense that Alter Rebbe goes to Mishnah's verse, which is the original. So let's see. Because Rabbeinu Azakim Sover, the Alter Rebbe is of the opinion, as he cites to when he writes the Haggadah, right? Alter Rebbe wrote a Siddur, which includes the Haggadah. And as I mentioned earlier, the Haggadah text itself includes our Mishnah, which says to see yourself as if you left Egypt. Right? So how does Alter Rebbe quote the Mishnah in his Haggadah? Shagirsa ikrib Mishnah anal, that the primary text or version of the Mishnah is is as the text appears in most of the books, most of the manuscripts, where it says, "B'chol davadar, in every generation, supposed to see yourself as if Egypt, etc." Shnemar, where it says there, the Mishnah says, why are you supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt? Because the verse says, on that day you will tell your child, because of this God did to me when he took me out of Egypt. Whereas Rambam's version of the Mishnah, remember, didn't have any verse. Remember that?
Yeah.
So in the Mishnah, we have two versions. One version, which is our version, which the Alter Rebbe quotes, which is that the Mishnah does cite to a verse, and the verse the Mishnah cites to is where it says, "On that day, you should tell your child, this happened to me." Rambam's Mishnah doesn't have any verse, so Rambam could choose any verse as a proof for why you're supposed to demonstrate yourself, but he decided to choose the verse which says, "By and us you took out of there." Follow? So Alter Rebbe, which has the primary version of the Mishnah, which is our Mishnah, which has a different verse, the verse, because God did this to me, that's the verse he's going to cite to. Is it clear?
Yeah, somewhat, but it seems like the stress is being the stress is being placed on not so much the difference between seeing and demonstrating, as opposed to what the stress I see here is to me. Meaning you have to either see or demonstrate.
Yes, we're getting. Yes, correct. Yes.
That's where I see the argument.
That's the main question.
Being framed here, not
Yes.
so much whether it's seeing or demonstrating, but rather that we right now have to see as if we.
Correct. So, okay, so let's make that clear then. There's two components here. One is that you're saying that the verse seems to imply in a bunch of places I'm supposed to see as if it happened to me. Okay, which verse you choose? Good question. Rambam chooses one verse. His Mishnah had no verse, and our Mishnah has a different verse, and Alter Rebbe takes that verse from our Mishnah.
Right.
Fine.
And
But question B, now number two is, 1 second, is demonstrate myself, which is more than seeing me, right? So the question of how we got to the idea of demonstrate, that's a question we have. That's our main question. We're going to put that right now on the side.
Yeah. Okay.
But however we answer that question, we still also need to address, and that's what Rebbe is doing now, which verses are being cited and why.
Sure.
And that's what's being addressed right now.
And could this also be tied in to the fact that Rambam on more than one occasion has had different versions of the Mishnah?
Okay, so the Mishnah of the version, so we know which version the Rambam had, because we know from his Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah, we also know from his Haggadah. And the version he has no verse.
Has no verse.
That's right.
So, like you said, he could choose any verse.
Exactly. That's correct.
To support his claim of demonstration.
That's correct. That's correct. So therefore, now it's like this. The Alter Rebbe, which does have a version of the Mishnah that has a verse, Alter Rebbe is going to quote that verse, which is different than Rambam's. Because Rambam doesn't have any verse. Because Rambam's Mishnah didn't have any verse. But this to itself, that the Alter Rebbe and Rambam are looking at two different versions of the Mishnah, time of boy, this itself requires explanation. Why they're looking at two different versions. We also, the further question. When the Alter Rebbe cites to the verse to prove that a person is supposed to see himself as if he left Egypt, he cites only part of the verse, whereas the Mishnah quotes more of the verse. Why? So Alter Rebbe quotes the part which says, quote, because of this God did to me when I left Egypt. And he excludes the section of the verse, which is, you should tell your child on that day, saying, because of this, you took me out of Egypt. That first opening, the preamble, which says, and you should tell your child on that day, saying, that part, Alter Rebbe does not quote. Shehuva b'Mishnah, which the Mishnah does quote. So why did Alter Rebbe skip that part?
All depends who you're talking to also.
Sorry?
All depends who you're talking to also. One is if you're thinking yourself.
Yes, but 1 second.
The other is you're explaining it.
Yes, that's fine. That's all fine. Let's make this clear. Alter Rebbe and Rambam do not invent their own ideas.
No.
They're taking them from Mishnah, from the Gemara.
No.
So we look at the Mishnah, we see the way it phrases it, and then we look at Alter Rebbe and see the way he phrases it, and we see it's different. Why? So what you think about that verse is not relevant. I mean, the question is why did Alter Rebbe change it? Why didn't you follow what I'm saying?
Trying to be more like in mind.
Well, Rambam quoted a different verse entirely. Rambam quoted the verse of Sano Haitzi Misham.
First, but the same outcome. Maybe.
Fine, but that's perfectly fine. Same outcome. We still have to ask ourselves why different verse.
Sure.
And that's the question here. Yeah. Okay. Ve'ein loymar, and we cannot say Sharaya dad morazakin. that the Alter Rebbe's proof, where he only quotes that part of the verse which says, because of this God did to me when I left Egypt, he is not as a proof to say that you're obligated to demonstrate yourself to see yourself as if to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt.
Oh, that was what I was alluding to.
Okay,
Okay,
ki'im, but rather, just the Alter Rebbe is quoting it as a proof that the idea of Exodus from Egypt exists all the time, but not as a proof that I happen to demonstrate myself. Which is why he does not quote the first half of the verse, the preamble, which says, "And you shall tell your child." Right? Key
That's
because
the first part of the verse?
yes,
Okay.
he says, "You should tell your child on that." Yes, you should tell your child on that day because of this God did to me when I left Egypt.
Mhm.
So Alter Rebbe takes the first part out. You should tell your child on that day. Take that out, and just the second part, which is what you're telling him, namely, because of this that God did to me when I left Egypt.
Still only a proof of perhaps seeing yourself leaving.
It's only a proof for the idea that the Exodus exists all the time, but not for anything about what I have to say, which is why the Alter Rebbe did not quote the first half of the verse, which says, "And you shall tell," because if anything, "and you shall tell your child" actually indicates some sort of demonstration, but that part took out. Right? So that can't be the explanation for the Alter Rebbe, because first of all, why wouldn't he quote that first part, which actually says to demonstrate yourself?
Yeah, good point. Even though he still sides with Rambam, he's not using that preamble,
Which would indicate to do something. Exactly.
His position with Rambam.
Exactly.
It must be something else.
Correct. And moreover, says the Rebbe, if you want to go concise, and that's why he's taking out the preamble, you can get even more concise. He could have just said the words which says, okay, so the full verse is like this. "And you shall tell your child in that day, because of this, that God took me out of Egypt." Alter Rebbe quotes, "Because of this, that God took me out of Egypt." You want to get concise? Just put the part which says that God took me out of Egypt. Forget "because of this." Why have the words "because of this"?
Because then the kid asks,
We're not talking about the kid right now. Put it aside. Put it aside. We're specifically talking about one law. Demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt. Which part of the verse is necessary for that? Kid's not necessary here. I'm not talking about kid right now. We're talking about demonstrate myself as if I left Egypt. So the only part of the verse relevant is that God took me out of Egypt. That happened to me. Why add the word bivor zeh because of this? If you're trying to get concise. And if you're not trying to get concise, zoom out to the whole verse. On that day, you should tell your child, etc. Yeah? Okay. So again, we're not expecting anybody to remember all these questions because there's lots of them and there's still more coming.
So is it from because
We haven't got
the
the explanation will come tomorrow. We still have one more set of questions before we go to tomorrow's explanation. Yeah.
Is it because of this part?
Yes, those words bivor zeh are irrelevant.
We're going to say is the reason for the demonstration?
Well, let's see. Maybe, perhaps. That's what it would seem like. So this is the Rebbe's pushing us. Okay, before we get to the explanation, which is coming tomorrow, we still have more questions to pile on.
I don't get it. When you're talking to yourself, you could say, because of this, God took me out of Egypt.
You're not talking to yourself here. We're citing a verse to prove a point. So you're talking about what the verse is saying. That's not relevant right now. What's relevant is how do you get from that verse to this specific halacha that I have to see myself as if I left Egypt? Which part of that verse tells me that? That's what's relevant. Everything else, the fact that the verse happens to be talking about in context that you're having a conversation with your kid, is irrelevant to which part of this verse is necessary to prove this specific halacha. The context of the verse is almost irrelevant. Or at least so it would seem.
So me should be taken substitute by us.
So Rambam quotes a verse which says us. Alter Rebbe quotes a verse, and so does our Mishnah quote a verse which says me, which means I have to see myself as if I left Egypt. And yet Rambam and Alter Rebbe tell us the halacha is not just to see yourself as if you left Egypt, but to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt. Where'd they get that from? Okay, so this is what we're trying to get to.
Grateful that Rambam left out his sources because this is what a lot of this scholarship wouldn't make it.
Okay, so one more set of questions before we get to the explanation tomorrow. Hey, bottom right of page 41, where it says, hey, oid shinoi, another distinction, b'shulchan aruch admor hazaken, in the Alter Rebbe's code of Jewish law, lagabe harambam, with respect to Rambam. Another difference between Alter Rebbe and Rambam. Even though generally speaking they agree, because they both
They concur.
They both concur that the halacha is not just to see yourself, but to demonstrate yourself. They both concur on that point, which again, we still don't know where they got that from. But there are differences, distinctions in how they present that. First of all, how they cite the verses. Alter Rebbe cites the verse, because of this, God took me out of Egypt. Rambam cites the verse, and you took us out of there. Here are some more distinctions.
Because of this.
Because of this, that's right. Alter Rebbe has the word because of this. Lashon HaRambam. The Rambam's terminology or his phrasing is, quote, Val davar zet tziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu, b'Torah, and of this God commanded in the Torah. Rambam is speaking now. The Zacharta, you shall remember, ki eved ha'yisa, that you were a slave. Kalaymar, meaning to say, continues Rambam, ki lo ata ba'atzmcha yisa eved, as if you yourself were a slave, etc. End quote. That's Rambam's phrasing. Vilu loshen admor zakani. But here's the Alter Rebbe's phrasing. Val davar zet tziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of this God commanded us, which is a direct quote from Rambam. But here's a change. The Zacharta ke eved ha'yisa b'Mitzrayim. You shall remember you were a slave in Egypt. Kilo ata ba'atzmcha ha'yisa b'Mitzrayim, as if you yourself were in Egypt, eved a slave. Rambam just says, of this Torah commands, remember you're a slave. You should see yourself as if you're a slave. Alter Rebbe says, of this God commanded, you should remember you were a slave in Egypt and see yourself as if you were in Egypt. Alter Rebbe stresses Egypt. Why the change? Why does Rambam leave out Egypt? Just remember you were a slave? Whereas Rambam, Alter Rebbe highlights, no, remember you were a slave in Egypt specifically.
Just made it more clear, that's all.
Maybe. Or maybe he's trying to add a nuance. Let's see. Alpia Yedua, top left of page 41. Second left-hand column. Alpia Yedua, based on that which is known. Shirabeinu Hazakan, that the Alter Rebbe, Dayak B'Lashono, was very precise in his language. Lashono Hazahav, his golden language. Chol Teva in every single word. Alter Rebbe was known to be very precise in his wording.
They didn't gloss over anything.
Didn't gloss over anything.
No, the reader or the learner
should not gloss over anything.
should
That's
not
correct.
gloss over anything.
Every word is precise.
Word
Correct.
or meaning.
Absolutely. Therefore, near a border, it seems clear to me, says the Rebbe. From the fact that the Alter Rebbe Meshana Miloshen HaRambam changes from the wording of Rambam, who he's quoting, Moisef Tevis Mitzrayim, and adds the word in Egypt. Not just remember you were a slave, but remember you were a slave in Egypt. And he does this twice. Once when he quotes the verse, and you shall remember. And likewise when he explains the verse, meaning to say, you shall remember you were a slave in Egypt. He adds it twice, the word in Egypt. His intention here is to teach us this obligation to see yourself as if you, what? It's not enough that you should demonstrate yourself as if you stop being a slave. Not enough. But you have to see yourself as if you were a slave in Egypt. In other words, in theory, I can demonstrate my freedom by imagining that I was a slave next door and now I'm free. And that would satisfy Rambam's phrasing. You see yourself as if you're a slave and now you're not a slave. Now, the Rebbe is saying, no, I want you to see yourself as if you were a slave in Egypt. Servitude in Egypt is a unique servitude. The verse describes the servitude in Egypt as being excruciating. So not just to see yourself as if you were a slave. Some slaves are treated very nicely.
I think that
In history, you could have slaves that were treated nicely. So seeing yourself as if you were a slave could be nice. In fact, the laws of slavery in Torah, you have to treat your slave almost like an equal. So said the Alter Rebbe, no, I don't want you to see yourself like you're that kind of slave. I want you to see yourself like you're a slave in Egypt. The Rebbe adds, we can suggest, this detail, the Das Rabbeinu Hazaken, following Alter Rebbe's ruling, who Gamli Kuva, is actually not just, in best case scenario, you should see yourself as if you were a slave in Egypt. No. That's the required halacha. You have to see yourself as if you were a slave in Egypt specifically. If you were to imagine yourself and to demonstrate yourself as if you were freed from ordinary slavery, you didn't fulfill your obligation. Whereas according to Rambam, you will have fulfilled your obligation because you didn't add the word in Egypt. And according to Alter Rebbe, no, you will not fulfill your obligation. You have to specifically see yourself as if you left the slavery of Egypt, which is the most intense slavery. Often that one word. Yeah, what do you want to say?
Rambam presumably meant in Egypt, no?
Well, you would think so, but you know something?
He left it out, so obviously
Exactly.
there's wiggle room.
Exactly. And not just that, the Rebbe pointed to other questions before that demonstrate that Alter Rebbe left out the word, Rambam left out the word Egypt a few times already. The Mishnah said you should see yourself as if you left Egypt. Rambam writes you should see yourself as if you left the slavery of Egypt.
He says in Egypt.
With respect to that part, yes.
So then it seems
not the second part though.
Okay, but
so the question becomes why?
Then he could argue that he meant. I mean, you could argue. I mean, you could reasonably argue that.
Maybe.
Rambam
Let's see, but he still didn't.
Egypt. If he said it once in one context.
Maybe. Let's see. But yes, maybe. Actually, to your point, Alan, the Rebbe puts in footnote 21 and says, "Don't tell me that Alter Rebbe is just explaining what Rambam meant." Why? Because the words that the Rambam quotes, the Zacharta ki eved Yisa, remember you were a slave. The very next word in the verse is in Egypt, and the Rambam decided not to quote that word. If the word in Egypt didn't exist in the verse, okay, so Rambam didn't say it because it's not in the verse. But the word is in the verse,
and he
isn't including it. So the Alter Rebbe is actually putting it back in. In other words, whereas Rambam decided to leave the word in Egypt out, Alter Rebbe says, hey, it's in the verse, put it back. Which means Alter Rebbe is not just explaining Rambam, he's deferring from Rambam. To your point also. So very good. It's footnote 20 there. Okay, so let's conclude. The Tzarechim, we have to understand, where does the Alter Rebbe get this idea to argue with Rambam? And to come up with a new idea. That the person is obligated to demonstrate himself as if he was freed or redeemed from the unique servitude of Egypt. Where does he get that from? We also understand.
Presumably right from the verse.
Well, yes. Then the question becomes, why did Rambam leave it out if that's the case?
I
think that's the strong
yes,
question.
but 1 second. But the verse doesn't. 1 second. Here's the verse. The verse says, "You shall remember you were a slave in Egypt." It doesn't say demonstrate.
No, we're not on that issue.
So somehow this verse, which tells you to remember you're Egyptian, remember you were a slave, also tells you to demonstrate. But the demonstration part of it didn't come from that verse. It came from the other verse. Either you took us out of there, or because of this, you took me out of Egypt, right? Either one of those two verses that were quoted earlier. This was the next part of the phrasing, which is, and of this the Torah commands, remember you were a slave. But the demonstration yourself came from the previous verse. Right? So it becomes very confusing. Yeah. Once you read the sentence on its own, it's like, okay, it's a nice sentence. But then you start breaking it down, like, hold on a second, what's going on? It's all going to become clear tomorrow. Everything. All right. So conclude now. Final question before we get to the explanation tomorrow. Bottom left column of page 41. Gam tzarich love, we also have to understand. Lashon Rambam the Rambam's wording is, quote, v'yotzas l'cheres v'niftas. See yourself as if you were a slave and you were taken out to freedom and redeemed. That's the order. You were taken out to freedom and redeemed. The Alter Rebbe changes the language of the Rambam and rearranges the order. V'kaisiv writes, the niftis you were redeemed, the yotzas l'cheres and went out to freedom. So Rambam puts went out to freedom and then redeemed. Alter Rebbe puts redeemed and went out to freedom, switching the order.
What does it mean redeemed in this context?
Good question. But usually in the context of being a slave, it means you had 10 or more years of servitude. So someone paid your boss out, and now you're free.
That usually comes before then the actual freedom. You have to be redeemed. Right?
You got to be redeemed first and then go out. But Rambam puts it the other way. You should see yourself as if you went out to freedom and redeemed. Whereas Alter Rebbe puts it and redeemed and then went out to freedom. Switching the order. So what's going on with that? Okay, so we have all these kinds of questions. We have two different versions of the Mishnah. One version of the Mishnah, the Mishnah says, see yourself. One version of the Mishnah has no verse.
That's Rambam.
Rambam's version. Our version of the Mishnah has a verse which says, you should tell your child on that day, because of this, God took me out of Egypt. We have Rambam Alter Rebbe, which changed from the Mishnah and say, not just see yourself, but demonstrate yourself, wherever they got that from. But then Rambam quotes a different verse entirely because his Mishnah didn't have any verse, so he quotes a verse, and you took us out, and us you took out from there. Alter Rebbe has the verse of our Mishnah, but not quoted exactly the same way our Mishnah is quoted. And then there's a bunch of differences between Rambam and Alter Rebbe. And then the Rambam itself is different to the Mishnah too in other ways. For example, adding the word mishibud, adding the word servitude. What else did I miss?
Mitzrayim, adding Mitzrayim.
Alter Rebbe took out, added bin Mitzrayim, whereas Rambam took out bin Mitzrayim. A whole bunch of questions, a whole mess.
Redemption is
Redemption, different orders.
different orders of redemption and freedom.
So we have a whole mess of ideas. A verse is quoted, phrasings used, stressing Egypt, not stressing Egypt, stressing slavery, not stressing slavery. See yourself, demonstrate yourself. All of that
Why does the Alter Rebbe depart from the Rambam?
in certain ways. And we have to figure all that out. And God willing, tomorrow, the Rebbe is going to turn on the light and all the questions are going to disappear.
'Cause
That's
right
coming
now,
tomorrow, God willing.
Right now, I don't see it.
I'm telling you, it's one of the most amazing things. Sorry?
Right now, I just don't see it properly.
Tomorrow's going to come all clear. Now, if you're confused, you're supposed to be. There's lots of questions. That's very confusing.
Put
No.
gelatin on it.
And everything will come. All
If you
the,
just say you're a slave, you could be a good slave, or you could be a slave that's been brutally.
right, exactly. So
So
the
that's
fact
why you
that,
have to say Egypt.
right. So then the
That's
question
the
becomes,
only
why Rambam
place-
didn't say Egypt?
I
Right.
know. I
Whichever
don't-
way you explain it, you have to understand the other way, right?
Maybe you took it for granted.
But you see, that's what they was pointing out in that footnote, that it can't be taking it for granted because
It was the
he's
next-
quoting the
it was
verse,
the next-
and it's the very next word of the verse, but he doesn't quote it. You're quoting that verse anyway. Just put the extra word in there. Like if it wasn't in the verse, okay, it's just quoting the verse in its entirety. But he's not quoting the verse in its entirety. He's skipping the word from Egypt, which is like, why are you doing that? If that's the point.
But he was a very brilliant man.
Oh, so
He probably took it for granted.
no.
I
So
think.
obviously he means something else if he's a brilliant man, which is what we're gonna have to figure out tomorrow. Okay, have a wonderful day, Eden.